The Hunting Ground. Kirby, first of all, I mentioned to the audience at the outset that this is your second film that we've featured here at the Folks Film Festival. The first was The Invisible War, and I think both films, you can't even watch them back to back. They're really emotionally draining. I've now done it twice, one, that, and this. You're a male, and yet you're a documentary filmmaker, and you have made two incredibly arresting, compelling films about horrible experiences for women, and under very similar circumstances, the chain of command issue in the US military, the need for universities to be able to put out a product without diminishing their brand in connection with The Hunting Ground. Why is this, is there a reason why this is a special issue for you?
Well, I mean, we all have mothers, we have, many have wives, girlfriends, daughters. I have a daughter. But, I think, people think about sexual assault and they think it's a woman's issue. It isn't. It's everybody's issue. If you're going to point it to one gender, you could say it's a men's issue because it's men who are doing most of the assaulting. So this is something, when I got into making the film, I was just, in both cases, in both The Invisible War, I was just astonished that I would hear the same stories over and over. And not only the assault, which was bad enough, but the way that the institution responded to that assault. And in both cases, it was, to protect the institution's reputation. And, in The Hunting Ground, we interviewed on camera about 70 survivors. We interviewed more than 100 additional survivors off camera, and you kept hearing these same stories over and over and over.
Sophie, this film and the experience that led to this film was life-changing for you. You actually ended up starting your own nonprofit. Maybe you can tell us a little about it, and Rape on Campus, which is you're co-founder of it. We saw you in the film. You're recognized now for this. You're a young person. It must be a weird experience. You didn't go to college for this kind of a career. College gave you this career. It's a different kind of job description. I wonder whether you've been able, you're so young, I wonder if you'll be able to reflect on this, twisted set of events that in many ways ruined your college experience and at the same time gave you this platform, this voice to help others.
Well, Berkeley was my dream school, and it still is, even after everything I've been through. I still love Berkeley. Not the administration so much, but the people who are there, the students, the faculty, the community there is something that I would potentially want to go back to someday. I really did love Berkeley, but the way that the institution treated me was just so opposite of what I was expecting them to do. They just did not care about student safety at all. My assailant was a serial perpetrator. He assaulted 4 women, and 4 of us reported to the university. And I just found out last week that now he goes to Harvard Law. So he was found responsible, but because they put him on disciplinary probation and there's, no notation on the transcript that he was found responsible, Harvard's just like, oh, okay, So I think that it has profoundly changed my life to have this happen. But I am really hopeful that this is a moment that we will look back on and view it as a time when a lot of things changed, when a lot of people came together in a really collaborative way and demanded that there was not going to be any more of this. And I'm really grateful that I had such a community of support, and that if I ever had to be sexually assaulted, that I was sexually assaulted at the time that I was, because I just so happened to be on campus when people were talking about this. And if I had been assaulted even a few years earlier, perhaps it wouldn't have been an issue.
I just wanted to say just a little bit about Sophie. Sophie was actually the first interview that we conducted. And I remember when I was doing the interview, you were what, 19?
Something like that.
Yeah, and we had never met. I never, I think, even spoken to you. I think it was my producer who had. And and you came into this strange house with a strange crew, and I mean, you told your story very, very well, but I was thinking, wow, you're so young. But you know, what she's accomplished has been amazing. I mean, I think has been one of the sparks, if not the primary spark, for the passage of affirmative consent in the state of California. And it's true. So I just want to say that this is, I mean, and Sophie and Annie and Andrea and all the other activists around the country are accomplishing so much.
Yeah, I think I think that going back to what you were saying about the work of our organization, End Rape on Campus, the organization that Annie, Andrea, and I started, we are primarily a direct service organization to survivors, so we routinely field inquiries from survivors who want to file Title IX complaints and hold their institutions accountable, which we help them do, or we refer them to legal counsel or therapists if that's what they're looking for. But we're also doing legislative advocacy too, and education.
I'm sorry,
And education.
So how many Title IX lawsuits have been filed since both the nonprofit was created and the film has gotten some exposure? How many are out there?
So Title IX complaints are filed to the Department of Education, and so they don't have to be filed with the assistance of an attorney. And those have gone up something like 200% over the past couple of years. So pretty stark increase, largely because there is that lower barrier to be able to hold your institution accountable. Many students don't have access to an attorney or the resources for an attorney, but this, as Andrea said in the film, allows you to take on your institution and have no legal background whatsoever. And so that was something that was really integral for this, was that we didn't have as high institutional barriers as exist with Title IX lawsuits. So Title IX lawsuits, as for how much those have increased, I'm not sure, but I have heard that they are rising as well.
And I just want to say that, I mean, you know, absolutely the activists have been so essential in bringing this to public attention. But I really think the administration, President Obama, Vice President Biden, deserve an incredible amount of you know, praise for this. I mean, this is the first time I've seen an administration speak out about this issue, talk about you know, repeat offenders. I mean, I was shocked when he said that. And the fact that they've continued to do this, they've continued to stay strong for year after year after year, I really think it actually gives me great hope. Because usually what you see with these things is that there's a few years where there's a lot of focus on the institution, and then it passes, and then it sort of falls back into its sort of business as usual. So, I mean, right now is a good time with all the attention on this.
I wonder, Kirby, though, is that also true of Vice President Biden and President Obama when it came to the invisible war? See, that's a little trickier because that's the U.S. military. Were they as forceful in speaking about the recidivism problem? You know, the issues are the same, the institutions are entirely different, and I can't help but wonder, in hearing you praise, were they able to praise in the same way or raise these questions when it came to their own, an American governmental institution?
Right. I mean, I know that they were, to some degree, working behind the scenes, but they weren't stepping forward.
In the same way?
No, they weren't. And, you know, we wish they would. There's no question about it. But again, I mean, this is historic. I mean, you know, just bringing this to the national attention and having schools. What you see with schools is schools, like any other institution, their first impulse is to cover something up. I mean, to protect their reputation. They're no different than anything else. But what's happened is, because of the pressure of activists, because of the pressure of the administration, the people within the institution who want to change have been supported, and they've been able to begin to put in policies. I mean, we have a long way to go, but. Can
you name one or two schools that have received the most improved award since the film has come out, that you could say, my God, they were nowhere, and now actually you're starting, there's a new president of the university, or there's a new provost, and this is a person that Sophie speaks to constantly, always seeking advice from her. Or they want to show the film every week. Is there any school that we really should send our kids to now?
Well, no, people should go to school. But I was just at the University of Memphis last night, and it was very interesting. There was I was on a panel with the general counsel. It was introduced by the provost. This doesn't happen a lot, and they were very, very aggressive on this. They're new. They've been in about a year or two. They seem really determined. We'll have to see what happens. I mean, there are schools that are doing some things right. Yale is relatively good, and I think better than any other school, as far as I know, in terms of being transparent about the reports of assaults and how they're adjudicated.
And what about that fraternity that was on campus? Because I have to tell you, that was one of the creepiest moments in your movie, with the Yale fraternity screaming, yes means, no means yes? No means yes, and then there was even a more vulgar piece after that.
Right. Well, I mean, one of the things that the Association of American Universities study that just came out that showed their figures were that 23% of undergraduate women are sexually assaulted while in college. It showed that the more elite schools actually had a somewhat higher rate. And that's one of the things that I think is important for people to remember, and I really want the film to convey, is this is not just a problem with big schools, party schools, sports schools. It's not. People think athletes, because athletes have high profile, and they sort of get all the coverage, but it's entitlement across all aspects of society is an issue here.
What is it like for you, though, Kirby? I mean, you're not just a documentary filmmaker. You've made these two last films that are very powerful advocacy films. United States senators have testimony, in part because of these two films that you've created. Young women like Sophie go off and start nonprofits. Provosts and presidents have to conduct, and general counsels, conferences about this question to demonstrate that they're taking it indeed more seriously. What has it been like for you?
Well, I just want to say Sophie would have done it anyway if there's no film.
Well, that's an interesting question. That's true that the film didn't propel your work. It didn't. It actually called attention to it, but it didn't initiate it.
Yeah, so what was really interesting about this documentary too is that it was being made as this process was unfolding. It wasn't looking back on something that had already happened, but it was actually documenting what was going on in real time. And that this organization that Annie, Andrea, and I started, we actually began that back in like August 2013, which was right when I did my interview with you. So
they both grew at the same time.
Right, exactly. They both went with each other, basically. And now what we've been seeing in the aftermath of the film is that many people have reached out to us and said that they saw it and that now they want to get help filing a complaint against their institution, or they just wanted someone to tell their story to and to feel supported.
So the film reinforces the work of the nonprofit, but at the same time, the nonprofit benefits from the film. There's a sort of mutual reciprocity in terms of its work.
Right, and when we were making the film, I mean, it was a real challenge because not only following a student movement as it's happening is a challenge, but this is a problem that's going on campuses around the country.
Right, so it's in real time.
It's in real time, and there's, we knew of dozens and dozens of cases, through Sophie, Annie, and Andrea, through other activists, through attorneys, through journalists, but we were following these, like I said, dozens of cases as they were developing. So it was a really kind of broad undertaking because what we wanted to do is we wanted to convey, what you see in the news is, a rape happened here, or it has a high number of rapes reported, and then you think that's the rape school. That's not the case. I want people, when they come away from this, rape is a problem on all college campuses. It may be somewhat less or more depending on the school, but it is an issue.
But you ended up making choices about certain schools and not some other schools, right? I mean,
Right.
Were there some schools that were left on the cutting room floor? I'm not asking you to, tell tales out of school, so to speak. That's a bad pun. But there may have been 4 colleges that just are so lucky that this film could only go an hour and 90 minutes. I mean, not an hour and 30 minutes, because if it had gone another half an hour, 4 more schools would have been implicated. How did you, I guess the answer to that is yes.
Okay.
how did you do this? Like, how did you know, how did you follow the trail? You know, you're making it sound like, well, Thane, it's everywhere. So you had to, were you just checking on local news stories? Were you calling local police departments? I mean, how did you know, how were you following this?
Well, again, we were working very closely with a lot of people who were right on the ground. That helped. You know, I was working with an excellent journalist, Amy Hurdy. You know, she'd been shortlisted for the Pulitzer.
And she was working on this?
Absolutely, you know, full time. So.
Where was she writing? What was she, where was she?
Well, she actually lives in Denver and has moved to San Juan Islands, but she, the piece that she's, you know, most well known for is writing on the Air Force Academy scandal. So she was very familiar with this. She's done a lot of reporting on it. And so, yeah, no, we had a great team, and we were just, you know, we just were following those cases.
Now, how much did the Invisible War play a role in raising your game and your sensitivity, not just to the issue, but your capacity to tell these stories? I mean, my guess is that it was an incredible experience to walk away from that and say, this is my next film. Watch me go, watch me run on this one.
I didn't initially, well, my producer, Amy Ziering, and I, we didn't initially plan to do this. It was when we were taking the Invisible War around to college campuses that the discussion would change in the Q&As from rape in the military to rape on college campuses. And we knew it was a problem, but we could just see it kind of rising up, and we felt we had to make a film. Interestingly, I actually think that the Invisible War had something to do with the rise of the student movement, because I think many of these survivors and activists had seen the film or were aware of the film, and I think they saw in the Invisible War people speaking out and change happening because of that, and society supporting these people. And I mean, that's speculative on my part.
Had you seen the Invisible War?
I had heard of it.
So when he asked to interview you, you were aware of that film?
Yeah, yeah.
You knew you were in good hands, right?
I was nervous, definitely, but I did watch the film, and I was pleased with what I saw, certainly, yeah.
I can't help, given that we talked about President Obama, I'm just wondering, in your mind, you've made these two films. Which issue, sexual assault in the military, sexual assault on campuses, in your mind, has the better chance for reform, change, improvement?
Wow. Well, there's been a great deal of reform, you know, from the Invisible War. I mean, former Secretary Panetta, Secretary of Defense Panetta, you know, changed policy within a few days or a few weeks after seeing the film. There's been many reforms passed through Congress. The most important reform, taking it out of the chain of command and having, you know, these crimes go through the military justice system, has not been done. That's Senator Gillibrand's bill. Senator Gillibrand and Senator McCaskill have teamed up to try to get a bill through Congress to address this, you know, sexual assault on college campuses. So I think, you know, there's no such thing as like a silver. I mean, taking out the chain of command would be huge, right? And that's an ongoing.
What's the equivalent here for college campuses?
It's more complex. It's more complex. One thing is that all schools should have climate surveys. You know, they should do anonymous surveys of their student body to find out the prevalence of sexual assault and how comfortable the students feel with reporting and everything else around that. Because without knowing the nature and extent of the problem, you can't address it. And if you don't do that, you're basically kind of covering up, you know, the problem. And then once they have that information, they should release it. In fact, I think there's to its credit, the Association of American Universities, most of those schools did release that. Initially they weren't, but they did. But I think there's another study that's come out, another set of schools, smaller schools, where at this point they're not releasing that information. To me, that's, you know, it's still participating in, like, no, I don't want to be known as the rape school. You know, it's happening. Let's deal with it.
What about, go.
Yeah, I just would like to elaborate on that too. I think that it's really important that we have a multi-pronged approach to dealing with campus sexual assault. You need to make sure that there's direct education and that we're having education about affirmative consent beginning not just in college, but prior to that, in high school and in middle school. And along with that, you have to make sure that if a sexual assault does arise, that the adjudication process that is in place is thorough, impartial, and fair. And that is unfortunately not the reality that we're in right now, but having those two facets is critical to ensuring that it's a better process.
What about something that would be similar to the chain of command issue, which is to say, take these matters out of the hands of the colleges themselves. Don't let the college police get involved. Let it be the city police department. Let it be the district attorney's office, and let it be a criminal matter, and let that be the adjudicative process, and let the university then understand that in the event of a finding of guilty, that some expectation would be, and so that not essentially taking it out of the chain of command of universities. Do you two agree with that, or you think that it's one of the things that's mentioned in the film is that the DA's office doesn't do a better job anyway, so that taking it away from the universities may not in fact improve it, it may not be covered up, but it may not be prosecuted either?
Yeah, so unfortunately, the criminal justice system is also not set up to deal with sexual assault. Only 2% of rapists will ever spend a day in prison. So it's not, unfortunately, a model system for these types of cases. And actually, what's interesting is that schools have a different evidentiary standard than the criminal justice system does. So there's what's called a preponderance of the evidence standard that exists with Title IX and with school cases. So that means that the school is basically deciding whether it was more likely than not that sexual harassment or assault occurred. And that is a much lower standard than what the criminal justice system has, which is beyond reasonable doubt. And so, unfortunately, even if we were to move cases to the criminal justice system right now, that wouldn't necessarily mean that things would get better for survivors. However, there has been talk about changing the definitions of consent in the criminal justice system, which could potentially have a positive impact.
Right, and then oftentimes, students don't, I mean, first of all, students have an option of reporting to both, and it's really up to them, and it's important that they be supported in each direction. But oftentimes, if somebody's in a very rigorous academic program, they don't want to take 2 years.
Yeah, I didn't want to do that.
Yeah, I mean, that's an example. And then, and then you look at Tallahassee. I mean, there are a lot of places around the country where it's still a problem. There's a lot of really great police departments. So, but the school still has a responsibility. If the police department doesn't take care of it, the school still has a responsibility to its students. And if it has evidence that this has happened, or if maybe it's happened repeatedly, and then they have to do something. Now, all they're doing is saying, you're no longer a part of our community. Now, it's serious, yes, but it's nothing like, going to prison, life imprisonment, perhaps the death penalty in some states. It's a completely different, and that's, I think, all communities have that right if they've gone through a fair process. And now, I think part of the problem, and there's been some criticism that the process sometimes isn't fair because it's not professionalized. You have to professionalize the investigative process and the adjudicative process. I mean, it's going to take a fair amount of money to do this. And the result of that will be is if somebody's assaulted someone, they will more likely be found responsible, and then they can be appropriately sanctioned. And in the rare cases where somebody is falsely accused, they will also be better protected by a more professional system. So, that's what we're advocating is that because this is such a serious problem, it should be right at the top of the school's agenda and should be supported financially.
How do you respond to people who say, look, college campuses are rampant with alcohol? The point is made repeatedly in the film. We want to empower women. How patronizing is it when we say women need special protection who can't hold their alcohol and go into a fraternity and then end up in someone's room, and what did they expect was going to happen? I mean, how do you respond to people who take this position that we should not hold that story in the same light as we do stories of women being attacked, while they're riding their bicycles and they're being attacked and pulled into bushes? This film is making no distinction in that. It's saying in every instance here, this film is basically saying, this is a fraternity problem, this is an alcohol problem, this is a dormitory problem. It takes a very different position, but it doesn't address the question of whether the idea behind this is much more patronizing and less empowering.
I don't think it's patronizing. I think if somebody is walking through a dangerous neighborhood and they're assaulted, okay, maybe that was a mistake in judgment, but that's still a crime and it's still tried and approached in the same way. You don't say to that person, well, you know, you're somehow responsible.
How could you go out at night?
Yeah, so I mean, there's something around sexual assault that people always, it goes into a different category.
Meaning that they're willing to excuse it, or they're just so uncomfortable about it that they want to treat it differently?
I think it's both. I think it's both. I mean, I think there's this feeling in society that, you know, that this doesn't happen at the rates it does. I mean, the numbers are out there, study after study after study comes back. It's so consistent, you know, between 15 and 25%. And even in these studies, you know, sometimes people say, well, you know, what are they talking about? What kind of sexual assaults they're talking about? Maybe they're talking about groping but the reality is, in all those studies, the rapes are coming in, and the rapes and attempted rapes are coming in the 10 and closer to the 15% rate. So most of those sexual assaults in all the national studies, in nearly all the national studies, are very, very serious crimes. It's a very serious issue, but there's something about society that wants to deny it.
But again, Sophie, I'll get to you in a second. I'm sure you have something to say about this.
Oh, yes.
I'm sure you, but I'm just saying, I couldn't help but notice that unlike, what was the name of the woman who wrote the memoir, Lucky? She'd also done the Lucky Bone, Alice C. Right, and that was a horrific rape story that takes you right, and I'm sure you're both aware of that memoir. But of course, there was a woman who was, you know, again, dragged into the bushes. I think she was attacked while she was waiting late for a bus. We know that part of the statistics of 20% of people, women or students are sexually assaulted, but the film really focuses on the party atmosphere. It doesn't focus so much on the numbers of women who were simply walking home from the library late. And I'm wondering whether you're saying, well, maybe, Thane, it's because those are actually far fewer. It's more often the case that it's part of the drinking culture, and it's in that context that we see this, and that's why the film focuses on this. It's not that you were baiting us into raising a moral question to say, well, you know, if we have to protect women even in these settings. When they themselves are voluntarily drinking. So Sophie, jump in.
Yes, please.
Sure. So over 90% of sexual assault cases involve a person assaulting somebody that they knew.
They know.
That they know. So
the Bushes thing doesn't.
The Bushes thing is one of the most prevalent myths that exists in our culture about sexual assault. And that is at the root of a lot of the problems that relate to sexual assault as well, with the tendency to blame the survivor for what happened. You know, it's like, oh, well, why were you walking outside late at night? As opposed to understanding the reality of the situation, which is, well, I went to a party with my friend and then this happened to me. Why should I have to fear my friends? Why should I have to fear people that my friends know? Why should I have to fear other students at my school? And so there are these really prevalent issues, unfortunately, that really go at the heart of why this is a problem, which is part of why having the education component is so important. Educating people that it's most often people taking advantage of people that they know, and that also alcohol is used as a weapon. It's not something where it's like, oh, a he said, she said situation, but I thought the film did a good job of showing that actually, no, this is predatory. This is something that is premeditated. This is something that people decide to do because they feel entitled to other people's bodies. They feel entitled to other people, period. And that is something that I think is really important to make sure that people are aware of as well.
And I think also sometimes people think, well, they knew each other, so it's not as serious. But actually, it's very, very serious. I mean, almost all the survivors that we interviewed, and and many of those are in the film, they go through very difficult times. I mean, they have PTSD. One of the things I just recently learned is that I think a statistic which is kind of shocking is that somebody who's been sexually assaulted is 13 times more likely, I believe it's either to attempt or commit suicide. I mean, that's how devastating it is. And
we have one example in the film.
We do, and we probably have many more that we don't know if they were attributed to sexual assault. And the same thing is true in the military. You know, there's that big discussion about all the suicides. There's a lot of thought that a lot of those had to do with military sexual assault.
So Sophie, since you are partially responsible for Jerry Brown signing new legislation, having California be an affirmative consent state, which is essentially a yes means yes state, can you explain this? Because I think there have been people in the audience who don't even understand. There's yes means yes, there's no means no. Those are two different ideas, right? But yes means yes in an affirmative consent context means that it's only verbal, so that if you see situations where someone gets naked, that's not yes. If a person brings out a condom, that's not yes. Are there other ways to say yes other than to say yes?
So the California law actually says that it can be verbal or nonverbal. So that's one thing. But of course, verbal is the best. That's what we try and emphasize, is that we need a profound shift in how we look at sex. If the media were to show images of sex that weren't people slamming other people up against the wall, then we would have a completely different culture. And so hopefully one day we will actually have images of people asking for consent. But right now, as the law stands, it says that it can be verbal or nonverbal. But if I always say that if you're not sure whether you're having consensual sex with someone, you should ask them.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually very important. If you have a doubt, I mean,
But if they're both drunk, which is so often appears the case, I mean, you know, you could say, this is a law school, some people simply don't have the capacity to enter into a contract because they were drunk. And so, you know, two parties say, yes means yes, let's shake hands. How likely, how realistic is that, especially in the fuzzy, hazy, murky land of inebriated kids?
So, I mean, we're not asking people to sign a contract or anything like that. What we're asking people to do is to be conscious of what they want, what their partner wants, and to be aware of the situation. If somebody is asleep, you shouldn't have sex with them. If someone can't get up because they are so intoxicated, you shouldn't have sex with them. If someone is slurring their words and doesn't make any sense because they're really drunk, you shouldn't have sex with them. There are just situations that arise that are so clearly not consensual, but oftentimes the schools aren't finding those cases as sexual assault cases.
So you're saying no dean of students before this film and your advocacy thought to say those things? Because those things seem pretty obvious to me. Some dean of students could go, in case you hadn't thought of it, let me tell you, if a person is asleep, don't have sex with them. If they're right, just no one ever thought to do that?
So, I mean, I can't say to any dean of students, but certainly Megan Warner, who was in this film, who's an activist, co-activist of mine at Berkeley, said that she asked students in the Greek system whether they knew that it was sexual assault to have sex with someone who was half asleep or asleep, and people were completely shocked by that. So I think we have to assume that there's a very low level of knowledge about these issues, unfortunately. And I also saw this when I was doing mini consent workshops outside of parties at Berkeley, when I would invite them into our house and say, hi, you know, welcome to our party. Before you go inside, what is consent? What do you need consent for? And what are some ways that you can ask for consent? And people were, you know, really appreciative, actually, that we had brought this up, because that made them feel a lot safer at the party, and it also made them think about consent in a way that they hadn't thought before.
And it didn't ruin the party.
No, it didn't ruin it. It made people so happy, actually.
They can't say, what a bummer. God, Sophie,
no,
I was really happy, and then you gave me these rules.
No, people came up to me afterwards and thanked me and said that they were going to do this at their parties, because now they felt like it was a much more welcoming and safe environment for them. And people also hadn't practiced how to ask for consent before, and they were really grateful that they'd been educated about how to do it.
And I think, you know, I think there's going to be a very positive byproduct from this, which is talking about sex. You know, there's always this myth that if you talk about sex, you destroy it. I think that's, you know, again, I think it goes back to our media, the films. It's like you just rush into each other's arms. Well, the reality is, you know, certainly in my experience, it's not that. You know, that does happen, but And so I think there's the more people talk about sex, I think the more a lot of other issues, and it's going to make for much more healthy relationships in all other aspects of their interacting.
In watching the film, there is definitely a Bonehead of the Year award that goes to the boy, what school was that, when he said, just because you say no doesn't mean it's not rape, doesn't mean it's rape.
Well, that was
Brown?
Was that Brown? That was great.
I think that
The
was
audience
Brown. I believe it
heard that.
was.
I
But
think that was his exact line. Just
that was
because
20 years ago. Not to say that I don't want to defend Brown, but I just want to.
That
Yeah.
interview.
Yeah,
That
yes.
action. Just because you said no doesn't make it rape. Jameis Winston, are you surprised that at the end of everything with this film, with CNN's endorsement, it's going to be appearing nationally on CNN at some point, with all the advocacy that Sophie and friends have done, that Jameis Winston was drafted #1, is playing weekly. Nobody, and I just want to say, this is a personal peeve that I've talked to my students for years because I keep thinking to myself, PETA must be the most powerful organization on earth because Michael Vick, with all of those apologies, couldn't go from game to game. Everywhere he went, he served time in jail. He apologized before and after jail, and even after jail. I think there's probably still people boycotting him, picketing. And I don't know, is anyone doing this with Jameis Winston? Because here he is. This is all so fresh in our minds. I think most people think that Tallahassee ignored this, the police, the university. I think most people believe that this was like really a laughable cover-up, not even a good one. And yet the NFL is celebrating a new hero. Is this surprising to you that he went #1 and you don't hear anything about this?
Well, you've seen this again and again and again with sports figures, both in pro and in college sports. But yeah, I mean, it was really interesting. I took the film down to Tallahassee. I certainly didn't show it on the campus.
Was he already out of school?
He left school, I think, shortly after he finished his second season.
I see.
Yeah.
Could you have shown it if he was at school? Would they have been interested in seeing it?
No, not at all. Not at all, no. But what I showed it in a theater down there, and then we had a sort of a panel afterwards, and somebody stood up in the audience and said, this is the first time Erica Kinsman's name has been mentioned, I've heard it mentioned in public in this town in a year and a half. So there's this kind of lockdown that happened. And Tallahassee and Florida State, it's a great school, it's a wonderful school. And Tallahassee is a really interesting, city. But you see this again and again and again around the country. So it's not just Jameis Winston, it's not just Florida State. He just happened to be a very high-profile story that we're following, but he's emblematic of many other stories.
I can't help but have to mention the story that came out in Slate. Some of you might have seen it, most of you probably have not. It basically challenges at least one of the stories, just one. And in fact, it seems to be one of the minor stories, or the story about the woman from Harvard Law School. And it points out some things that are not in the film, including, I realized, if it's true, she lied here in the film when she said, he was a friend of mine, but we had never had any sexual encounter. But in the Slate story,
No, she didn't
I thought
say
she
that.
said...
They weren't romantically involved at that time.
At the time.
And even in the trial, both the person who assaulted her and Camilla both agreed to that. They both admitted that.
That they had sexual encounter, but they decided to be friends.
Exactly.
So in the article, and again, it only talks about this one piece. In other ways, it's the film is, no one else has challenged any of the other stories. And what it's really saying is that there's things that are not in the film that might have been in the film, including that both the criminal court in Massachusetts and Harvard ultimately decided that there was not enough substantial proof of any evidence to have convicted him of an offense.
Well, that's actually not true. Those are both in the film. So, I mean...
The idea that in the end that neither the state of Massachusetts...
No. He was convicted. He was convicted for a non-sexual assault.
Which
but he
was
definitely
touching her
convicted.
breast, which was really what he was convicted of.
or probably multiple touching of her friend, yes, exactly. But what happened there, well, first of all, the article is error-ridden and completely misleading. And basically, the writer takes the position of the defense attorney. And, you know, there's thousands of pages of documents which we went through very carefully. I went through with Amy Hurdy. We know this backwards and forwards. It's, you know, and none of that gets, you know, mentioned in the piece at all. The reality is that there was an attorney who was hired by Harvard, who was an independent fact finder, interviewed both of them, found Camilla credible, you know, the accused or her assailant, you know, not credible, found that he was responsible for sexual assault. It went to an administrative board. The administrative board found the same thing. It went to a prosecutor. The prosecutor agreed and brought forth charges. The grand jury supported those charges, and then he was still convicted, even that. Now, we know that very often, you know, juries, you know, don't convict in the, you know, at the most serious offense. But the evidence is all there. Everybody who looked at this case closely believed that this happened. Now, what happened with Harvard, which was really unfortunate, is the Harvard process actually, I mean, she describes being in the administrative board because you get a sense of the kind of victim blaming, but they made the right decision in the end. The problem was it went through an appeal process, which was required, but in this appeal process,
It was the faculty overrode.
well, yeah, but it's they didn't include Camilla in the appeal process. They didn't even let her know that it was happening.
Right.
Which is a, you know, complete violation of Title
She comes
IX.
back to school,
Right.
only to learn
Exactly.
that there was an appeal while she was
exactly.
away.
Now that is, I mean, no one can consider that a fair process. And this is one of the astonishing things to me is that Harvard Law actually, you know, that was their, it was according to guidelines. I mean, they followed their guidelines, but the fact that those were their guidelines, that the accused could go through an appeal process without even involving, the complainant is really shocking. And in fact, when they had a settlement with the Department of Education, in the press release from the U.S. government, there was a case that was mentioned, it was so close to Camilla's, I believe it was Camilla's. That's how serious the government took and how critical it was of the way that Harvard Law handled this. Now, to its credit, Harvard Law has made some changes, I mean, I think they should make more, but you know, things are changing, and again, I don't want to just focus on Harvard Law. I mean, it's
it's important to know, though. I think it's important for us to know that the telling of that piece, which is
Right.
only a small piece of a
Right.
film, is something you stand behind.
Oh, completely.
You would not add anything to it. You wouldn't have changed any of it. That you stand by that piece.
I totally stand by that story. Yeah, and you know, anybody who sees the evidence and if it's presented all in front of you, I mean, it's a misleading story. This writer has a long history of doing that. She writes about statistics in the same way. You know, putting forward one particular study without mentioning that there's a 261-page critique by the National Academy of Sciences. So it's a completely misleading.
We're going to take some questions from the audience, but I have one more point to make. Tomorrow morning, actually, at NYU Law School, the American Law Institute is meeting, among other things, on this issue. There's a proposal for a provision that would be called the sexual penetration without consent provision. There's actually language, and there's no question that it's been inspired, the thinking behind this has been inspired by the film and by Sophie's advocacy. The interesting question, though, here is, and this is for the lawyers who come here tomorrow to discuss this provision, and apparently there are many or some who are opposed to this provision because the language says it would criminalize penetration. I mean, frankly, it just seems like this is a date rape provision because it's really saying it criminalizes penetration of a man who, quote, recklessly disregards that the woman has not consented. And it really raises an interesting legal question, like how would one know whether someone had recklessly disregarded?
Well, I mean, I don't know anything about it, so right. I'm just guessing that they're trying to raise the standard, I mean,
right.
make consent, what's the word for it? Instead of just a simple no,
right.
It's, you know, you have to say no 10 times or something like that.
Yeah, it's clearly
right.
a higher
yeah.
standard,
yeah.
and it's saying that the person having sex with someone, if you're going to be penetrating, you better really think about whether you have recklessly disregarded
right.
something that you should know you
right.
shouldn't be doing.
Right, so if somebody pulls a gun on you and you don't say, know.
Right.
You know, I mean, this is, you know, and again, let's keep in mind that so many of these assaults happen when people are incapacitated. There's multiple studies that show that close to and sometimes more than 50% of these assaults are happening when people are incapacitated. They're not even in a position
Right.
to, you know.
But it does make you think, though, that the film, again, and the advocacy has made lawyers and legislators think through this position and to try to find ways to address this very question, even if they're doing it in a way that might be problematic.
Well, the reality is, you know, the numbers of people who are assaulted, this is the real problem. Yes, people who are falsely accused, absolutely, that is horrible. There should be all kinds of safeguards in place. I mean, we both agree with that. And you know, I think that, you know, the situations where, I mean, we support the fact that, you know, somebody has a confidential advocate or to go through the process who's been assaulted. Likewise, the person who accused should have that same, because they're making a lot of, you know, important decisions there. But the reality is, what this country has failed to deal with is sexual assault, both within college campuses and throughout society. That's the real problem here. It's not the small percent of people who are falsely accused. It's a problem. I mean, it's always a problem if one person is. But let's keep the focus on the real major problem.
In both of these films, and since we've just seen The Hunting Ground, I'm just curious, in your own perception of yourself, are you a documentary filmmaker, or are you a crusading activist, or are you both? Is it possible to document the truth of a story, but to do it in such a way that there is clearly a point of view? You know, there's nothing in this film about the person that's been falsely accused and how his life was destroyed, right? That's a different movie, right? But we know that that's fewer numbers because we learn the statistics in the film that it's far fewer than 10% are false accusations, right? So it would seem absurd to focus on that because that's just a smaller part, but there isn't in there, and there's a reason, because there is a point of view of the film.
Well,
what are the rules for filmmakers, the documentary filmmakers in this case?
well, I mean, I think the most important thing is to tell the truth, to make a powerful film, and that's what I try to do. And I think that's what a lot of filmmakers try to do. You know, and that's what, you know, journalists try to do. I mean, you know, journalists can just tell the truth and know, they can know that, you know, releasing a story will have an incredible impact. In that regard, I don't think I'm any different.
That last point, actually, I'm going to credit that to Andy Von Salas, because that was actually a question that came from the audience. Let me ask one more, and then we'll say goodnight. Let's see, where was this? There was one on the university presidents. Yeah. Is there a way that university presidents can be held accountable, legally, morally, politically? It does seem that, you know, there is a very strong indicting piece of showing where the university president, you know, doesn't suspend the person until their season is over. 2 years, they get to play for 2 years. Is there a way that could have been, you know, the presidents in the film come across as, well, they're beholden to the alumni. They're beholden to the fraternity people. They're beholden to the brand, the institution. Is there a way, I mean, what kind of pressure, Sophie, have you thought that could be added just strictly to the university presidents to hold them more accountable?
Sure. So many people in the audience might be wondering what you can do to further hold your university accountable or further this movement. And I think that it is really important to engage alumni and to make sure that you're writing letters and making those letters public, or potentially putting your money that you would donate to the school in an escrow and saying that we're not going to contribute this to this school until so-and-so provision is adopted into your policy. But there are also many things that we can do in our community as friends and allies that I think are also very important, that aren't necessarily directly tied to college presidents. But for instance, making sure that we're supporting survivors as friends when they're coming forward to us, saying that we believe them and we support them and that we will help them in whatever way is best for them, whether that's reporting or not reporting, going to counseling or not going to counseling. The most important thing is to empower survivors to do what is right for them, because the power is what was taken from them. So I think it is really important to hold university presidents accountable in public ways, like with escrow funds or like with letters or demonstrations, as is shown in the film, but also making sure that on the ground we are also being supportive to our friends.
Right. I just want to say, I mean, no university president wants this, and in fact I know, because I've got sort of have in a couple of cases had this back channel communicated to me. Some presidents want this pressure because they don't have complete control over everything. There's a lot of other forces
They want to
at
point.
play.
They want to point to this film and to this level of advocacy that says, "Look, I've got to be more proactive here. I can't pretend that this isn't happening."
Right, and that helps them. And there's a lot of I'm sure there's a lot of presidents who really want to address this. And so it really has to come from everywhere. It has to come from students, alumni, faculty, the community. This is a national issue.
One thing that I would also say is that I was at a panel a couple of weeks ago with legislators from California, and for the first time people were actually talking about resources, and that resources really need to be committed to this if we want to address this issue in a meaningful way. And so I think that hopefully this film can be used as a way to move that conversation forward as well, that we're not going to be able to address this issue if we don't have the resources to do it.
All right, before we say goodnight to our special guests, a few things. Again, if you're taking CLE credit, you have to check out on the way out. Christine from the Wellness Center will be available to talk to you. She'll be in the back of the room. The Folks Film Festival continues next week on Tuesday in this room. We're going to be showing Serpico, the really iconic Sidney Lumet film, and we will be having Frank Serpico, who we actually located, and he will be here, and along with Cyrus Vance Jr., the Manhattan District Attorney. So that's going to be really a fabulous night. And then 2 weeks after that, the Folks Film Festival moves for one night to the 92nd Street Y. We're going to show Bonfire of the Vanities, where we'll have Tom Wolfe, who wrote the novel Bonfire of the Vanities, and we'll have Preet Bharara, the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York. We only get the best when it comes. We got Kirby and we got Sophie, and we want to thank them both for sharing this night with us. Thank you.